Following the death of the Queen, most denominations published liturgies and prayers that would be helpful at such a time of national mourning, along with lists of hymns that might also be especially useful. And on all these lists, and invariably within the top 2 or 3, was this one: "Great is thy faithfulness." You'll recognize the tune, even if not the words. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. And so on. That one was invariably in the top 2 or 3. It was written as a poem of gratitude to God by American Thomas Chisholm in 1923. He was 57 and he'd had decades of ill health, and he was set to music and published by one of his friends. There was something like 30 years later before it became well known in Britain and around the world as a hymn, suitable for a time of mourning, a time of reassessment, a time of asking big questions. The phrase, "Great is thy faithfulness," though, was more than just an inspired cliche. It's actually a reference to the Book of Lamentations in the Bible. Not a book that many people read very often, and may not even be one that you've ever heard of. Because the very word Lamentations tells its own story, doesn't it? And you can guess from the title that it's not a particularly cheery book. But I guess that's its appeal, and ultimately the appeal of this hymn. I sometimes wonder if we've lost the capacity to deal with hard times, preferring instead to gloss over tragedy and loss, especially when it's someone else's issue. But right now, the loss of our Queen of 70 years isn't somebody else's issue, it's our issue. And the magnitude of it, in terms of the very fabric and structure of our society, is something none of us can ignore. Knowing how to lament, how to grieve in ways that will bring healing and restoration is an important part of being fully human. The Queen put it very poignantly herself in the context of the events of 9/11 in the US, when she said that grief is the price we pay for love. Christians aren't exempt from any of this, and there are no simple answers because the questions are not straightforward. It's easy to turn grief into debates about the nature of evil and of loss, but in the end of the day, grief isn't about those sort of questions. It's about asking ourselves, who's on our side? Who might support us in ways that will enable restoration and healing? To put it simply, who will comfort us? For Christians, I think this is where Jesus comes in. There are many legitimate ways of identifying the heart of his story, but there can be no doubt that comfort is one of them, and possibly the one most relevant to us at this moment. Why do I say that? Well, the very first page of the New Testament, recalling an ancient prophecy, gives Jesus the name Emmanuel, which St. Matthew reminds us means God is with us. Not only is God with us, but as the story of Jesus unfolds, it becomes clear that God is for us, identifying with our daily struggles and stresses just by sharing in our humanity. And as St. Paul later said, if God's for us, then who can be against us? So, what comfort can we take from the story of Jesus? Whenever faith looks like getting complicated and disconnected from everyday life, I always go back to the Gospels to remind myself of the key elements of his ministry. And one of the most striking things is the way that he constantly asks questions and very rarely gives any answers. This was perhaps the one thing that really frustrated those around him, because they were looking for answers to tough questions. It's not that Jesus downplayed the questions. What he most often did was to rephrase the questions in ways that had within them the seeds of new ways of looking at things. Was he Messiah? Well, yes, but it all depended what you thought about that word and its meaning. And if it conjured up an image of an all-powerful leader who would sort everything out, then that wasn't his understanding at all. Would following him make a difference to your life? Well, yes again, but it didn't mean you'd have an easy ride. More likely that you might suffer like him, whether literally or metaphorically. There's no denying that we have a lot of questions today. The message of Jesus is, that's okay, but make sure you ask the right questions in the right way, and be ready to see yourself as something to do with how they might be addressed. Then there's healing. This was perhaps the most public hallmark of Jesus' work, bringing restoration and renewal not just to the marginalised, but to the rich and the powerful as well, whenever they were prepared to acknowledge that they did actually need healing. It would be a brave person to claim that everything's fine in today's world, whether we look at the big picture of global stability, both in the natural world and in human relationships, or at the little pictures of each of our lives. Complaining is easy and natural. Acknowledging that we might not actually be self-sufficient in addressing our deepest needs is much more challenging. And finally, maybe the one you thought I would mention first is the way that Jesus told stories. Telling stories has been the way people make sense of things from time immemorial. Stories about ourselves, about our families, about our interactions with others. Since the Queen died, social media has been absolutely full of stories of when people met her or her family, because it's by telling stories that we begin to sort things out and hopefully make some sort of sense of them. Each of our little stories might seem inconsequential, but Jesus invites us to put them in relationship with the bigger story, the story of what God is up to in the world. Something he refers to as God's kingdom, or as an old friend of mine used to say, it's just God's way of doing things. And it's different, and it's life-giving, and it's healing, and it's full of promise. You might be thinking that's a lot to get out of a favourite hymn. Well, I may agree with you on that. But it'll not be the last word on comfort at this time. But what I'll be taking away from it is this: that we can be proactive in finding comfort, asking questions rather than avoiding them, being open to accept healing, and reflecting on the big story of God as told by Jesus as the way of making sense of our own little stories.